The paper hit the table like a gunshot. Lillian Keene did not flinch. She stood in the middle of the Harrowfield County Courthouse, her dark wool skirt dusted with the red clay of a 2-day ride, her jaw set with the kind of quiet fury that comes not from impulse but from absolute certainty. Around her, a ring of men watched with the barely concealed smirks of those who believe they have already won. Congressman Harold Vetch, representing the interests of the Great Western Railroad Company, leaned back in his chair at the head of the long pine table and let a slow smile spread across his sunburned face. "Mrs. Keene," he said, drawing out each syllable the way a man does when he thinks the syllables belong to him, "the survey is complete. The route has been approved. The eminent domain filing was submitted to the territorial court in Abilene 3 weeks ago." He folded his hands. "You cannot stop this." Across the room, standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and his dark eyes unreadable, Joel Bailey watched her. He had not spoken since she had walked through the door. He was a big man, wide in the shoulders, with a jaw like quarried stone and hands that had driven cattle across 600 miles of open territory. He owned the ranch that sat between Lillian's small homestead and the open prairie beyond, and according to every man in that room, he was the one the railroad truly wanted. His land, his river access, his 15,000 acres of deep Kansas grassland. But Lillian had something nobody in that room had accounted for. She reached into the saddlebag she carried over one shoulder, moved past the land survey, past the eminent domain notice, past the letter of intent stamped with the seal of the Great Western Railroad, and she pulled out a leather folio bound with a cord of rawhide. She set it on the table without haste, untied the cord with steady fingers, and laid open a document that was covered, edge to edge in dense, precise handwriting, and a series of hand-drawn maps with measurements marked in fractions so exact they would have made a professional surveyor pause. "Congressman Vetch," Lillian said, and her voice was clear and completely calm, "your railroad cannot cross this land, any of this land, because the survey your company submitted is built on a falsified property boundary. The original government land grant recorded in 1867, under the Homestead Act, placed the eastern boundary of Mr. Bailey's property approximately 412 yards east of where your surveyors marked it, which means the proposed route crosses, at its western curve, through a strip of land that was never legally transferred from federal territory. Your eminent domain filing is void. You do not have a valid title claim to condemn." The silence that followed was not the polite silence of men thinking. It was the silence of men whose legs have been cut from under them before they understood the floor had moved. Joel Bailey pushed himself off the wall. He stared at the folio she had laid open. His dark eyes moved across the maps, across the measurements. He said nothing for a long moment. When he finally looked up at Lillian Keene, something had shifted behind his eyes, something that had not been there 30 seconds before. Nobody had expected this. Nobody in Harrowfield County had expected anything from the Prairie widow except grief and eventual surrender. She had buried her husband 14 months ago. She had no family within 300 miles. She ran a small homestead on the edge of the Kansas grassland with a handful of hired hands and a herd of cattle that most men in town called modest to be polite. She had no law training. She had no business connections. She was 31 years old and she had walked into this room alone, and every single person in it had expected her to be rolled over like a wagon wheel over dry grass. Harold Vetch's smile had gone. In its place was something rower and far less certain. "Where," he said, his voice now clipped, "did you get those maps?" "I drew them," Lillian said. She had spent 4 months drawing them. It had started the October morning, when the railroad's first surveying crew had crossed onto the western corner of her land without notice or permission, driving stakes and stretching wire, as though the ground belonged to whoever arrived first. Lillian had been mending a fence line near the creek when she'd spotted them. She had ridden over, asked for their authorization, and been told, politely but firmly, that the Great Western Railroad had filed a federal route application and that the process was simply moving forward. She had gone home that night, cooked supper for her two ranch hands, put out the lamp, and lain awake in the dark room where her husband, Thomas Keene, had died the previous January of a lung sickness that had taken him quietly and without warning, like everything else that had ever been taken from her. Thomas had been a good man. Not a passionate one, not a man who made her feel the way she suspected some women felt, but a decent, patient man who had worked the land with her and built something real. He had left her the homestead free and clear, a small herd, enough money to last a year if she was careful, and a reputation as a capable woman that the town of Harrowfield had promptly set about dismantling the moment he was in the ground. After the surveyors left her property that October day, Lillian had not cried. She had gone to her shelf and taken down every government document she owned, including her land grant papers, her property deed, the original boundary survey filed by the Territorial Land Office in 1867, and a collection of geological survey reports she had acquired years earlier out of pure intellectual appetite, because Lillian Keene had always had a hungry mind, and the Prairie had never quite satisfied it. She had spread everything on her kitchen table and started reading. What she found, after 2 weeks of cross-referencing dates and legal descriptions and plat maps, was a discrepancy. Small, quiet, hidden in the bland language of bureaucratic record-keeping like a snake in tall grass. The original Homestead Act land grant for this stretch of the Harrowfield territory had used a different baseline meridian than the survey the railroad company had commissioned. The railroad surveyors had calibrated from the wrong monument. Over the distance of several miles, that small error grew into a significant one, and the significance landed directly on the western curve of the proposed route, in the strip of land the railroad needed most to avoid the deep-cut ravine 2 miles north. Lillian had not told anyone, not immediately. She had spent the following 3 months verifying it from every angle she could, writing letters to the Territorial Land Office under a carefully neutral name, requesting copies of baseline documentation, cross-referencing with the United States General Land Office records she could access through the county recorder's office in Abilene. She had ridden to Abilene twice, bundled against the winter cold, telling no one where she was going except that she had business in town. She had taught herself enough of the relevant law to be dangerous, reading by lamplight until her eyes ached, borrowing legal texts from the county recorder's clerk, a quietly sympathetic young man named Davies who had recognized the precision of her inquiry and helped her without once condescending to ask why a widow needed to understand federal land survey law. And she had drawn the maps herself, because she had been drawing survey-accurate maps of her own land since before Thomas died, because she had always understood instinctively that property was only as secure as the precision of its recorded boundaries, and because no hired surveyor in Harrowfield County would have taken the commission without immediately reporting back to the railroad's land agent, a man named Garrett Hollies who had been spreading money through Harrowfield like seed corn since the previous spring. 4 months of hidden work, 4 months of secret knowledge, a trap built in total silence by a woman everyone had already decided was irrelevant. She had not told Joel Bailey either. That part was complicated, and it had its own kind of ache. She had first spoken to Joel Bailey in November, 2 weeks after the surveyors had come. He had ridden over to her fence line, not to be neighborly. She had understood that immediately, but because he had received his own notice from the railroad and was riding the perimeter of the contested land to understand what he was dealing with, he had been direct about it. No pretense of social call, no hat-in-hand politeness. He had simply pulled up his horse alongside her fence post and said, "They showed up on your land, too." "They did," she had said. He had studied her for a moment with those dark, straight-shooting eyes. He had said, "What do you intend to do about it?" She had said, "I intend to stop them." He had looked at her the way men in Harrowfield had been looking at her for 14 months, with a kind of measured, impersonal doubt, not cruel but thorough, the way you look at a fence post to see if it is sound enough to hold weight. Then he had said, "I've retained a lawyer in Topeka. If you want to join the filing, I'd consider it." She had thanked him and declined. He had ridden away without another word. That had been the sum total of their relationship through the winter, two neighbors on a contested strip of prairie, fighting the same enemy by different methods and not sharing intelligence. Except that Lillian had watched Joel Bailey from a careful distance through that whole cold season and had gradually, unwillingly, arrived at a set of conclusions about him that she had not asked to arrive at. He was not what Harrowfield said he was. The town tended to describe him as hard, closed off. A man who had come to Kansas from somewhere farther west with no explanation and no expressed desire to explain himself, who had built his ranch through sheer relentless work, who did not attend the church socials, who paid his debts on time and spoke plainly, and did not participate in the comfortable web of mutual obligation and gossip that held most small western towns together. What Lillian saw was something different. She saw a man who was precise, who paid attention, whose ranch hands stayed with him year after year, which told her something important about how he treated the people who depended on him. She saw a man who had once, in December, when the first hard freeze came, quietly repaired a section of her fence line that bordered his property, saying nothing about it, leaving no note, just doing the work and going home. She had stood at that repaired section of fence one morning in the gray winter light and felt something complicated and inconvenient uncoil in her chest. She had pushed it firmly back down. She had work to do. Joel Bailey, through the first months of 1874, had pursued his own strategy against the railroad. His Topeka lawyer had filed injunctions, argued procedural delays, requested a review of the land condemnation process. None of it had stopped the Great Western's machine. The railroad had more lawyers than a dog had fleas, and they had filed counter-motions and steamrolled the procedural arguments with the efficient brutality of a company that had done this exact thing in a dozen territories before Kansas. By February, Joel had lost the first injunction. By March, the eminent domain filing had been accepted by the territorial court. By April, when Congressman Vetch had arrived personally in Harrowfield with a team of lawyers and a surveying crew and an air of absolute finality, Joel had not quite given up, but he had narrowed down to a kind of grim, jaw-set endurance, a man defending ground he expected to lose. And then Lillian Keene had walked into the courthouse. Now she stood across the table from Harold Vetch, watching him process what she had just laid in front of him, and she felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has been underestimated for so long that the underestimation itself has become a tactical asset. Vetch looked at his chief surveyor, a lean, weathered man named Prentice who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table. "Well," Vetch said. Prentice took the folio, studied it, looked at two of the maps, and then looked up with the expression of a man who has just found a problem in a structure he was already standing inside. "She's using the 1867 baseline," he said. "The Quincy Meridian." A pause. "We used the 1871 reassessment point." The 1871 reassessment was the standard by that date, Vetch said, but his voice was no longer certain. "The Homestead Act grant was filed in 1867, Lillian said. "The legal description of the property boundaries in that grant derives from the 1867 baseline. Under federal law, the property boundaries are defined by the survey standards current at the time of filing, not subsequent reassessments. The territorial court in Abilene accepted your eminent domain filing based on the assumption that your survey was consistent with the original land grant. It is not, which means your condemned route corridor does not, in fact, cross titled property. It crosses federal territory, and you have not filed for a federal land right-of-way because you did not know you needed one." She reached into the folio and produced a second document. "I have a letter here from the United States General Land Office in Washington, responding to an inquiry I submitted in January, confirming that the 1867 baseline is the controlling reference for all Homestead Act grants in this territory filed prior to the 1871 reassessment. She set the letter on the table with the same quiet, deliberate precision. You will find it signed by the Deputy Commissioner of the General Land Office. The room was absolutely silent. Joel Bailey had moved forward from the wall. He stood now just behind Lillian's left shoulder, not intrusively, not in a way that crowded her, but in a way that was entirely different from where he had been standing before. He had moved without being conscious of moving. He was reading the letter over her shoulder, and every line of his face was doing something that did not have a simple name. Harold Vetch looked at his lawyers. One of them, the senior partner from a Topeka firm, a gray-haired man who had been in this business long enough to know what he was looking at, gave Vetch a very small, very controlled shake of his head. Vetch looked at Prentice. Prentice looked at the maps again and said nothing. Vetch looked at Lillian. "This would need to be verified," he said. "Verify it," Lillian said. "I can wait." What followed were 4 hours of the most technically dense, unexpectedly riveting land law argument that Harrowfield County had ever hosted, most of the county's male population having quietly crowded into the back of the courthouse, once word spread that something interesting was happening. Vetch's lawyers sent a wire to their Topeka office. Lillian produced additional documentation for every challenge they raised. She did not raise her voice once. She did not hesitate once. Every time a lawyer across the table attempted to introduce an alternative interpretation of the 1867 grant language, she had already anticipated it, had the relevant section of law cited and ready, had a cross-reference to a federal ruling that addressed the exact point. Joel Bailey stood a step back and watched her dismantle the railroad's case with the systematic precision of someone who had been building toward this moment for 4 months, and he felt something happen to his understanding of Lillian Keene that he was not going to be able to put back the way it had been. He had thought she was stubborn. He had thought she was brave, in the way that a person can be brave out of desperation and grief rather than out of strength. He had thought her refusal to join his legal strategy was the emotional pride of a widow who did not want to admit she needed help. He had been wrong in a way that was so complete it was almost admirable in its own right. She had not declined his help because of pride. She had declined it because she already had a better plan, and including him might have exposed the plan before it was ready. Around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Vetch's senior attorney pulled Vetch aside for a quiet, increasingly tense conversation near the window. Lillian stood at the table and waited, her back straight, her hands folded. She was tired, deeply tired, in the way of someone who has been holding tension in their muscles for 4 months and is only now feeling the full weight of it. She became aware that Joel had moved to stand beside her, closer than before. Not behind her shoulder, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool courthouse air. He said quietly, "You have been sitting on this since October." "Yes," she said, "you could have told me." She considered how to answer that honestly. "If I had told you, you would have wanted to help. And if you had helped, your lawyer would have been involved. And the railroad has men in every law office in this territory, and they would have found out, and they would have corrected the baseline error before the meeting, and we would have nothing." A long pause. "You trusted me not to hold the information. I did not know you well enough to take that risk," she said, which was honest. And then, because honesty required the whole of it, she added, "I am sorry." He was quiet for a moment. "Do not be," he said, and something in his voice was different from anything she had heard from him before. Quieter, more open. "You were right." Vetch turned back from the window. His face had undergone a significant rearrangement. The easy authority was gone, replaced by the tight-jawed composure of a man recalibrating. "Mrs. Keene," he said, "the Great Western Railroad would like to discuss an alternative route." Lillian said, "I thought you might." The negotiation that followed took 3 more days. It was not simple. The railroad did not abandon its plans for the Kansas territory. It simply had to find a path that did not violate the legal reality Lillian had exposed. This required genuine compromise, because the alternative routes available to them had their own complications, and because Lillian was not simply fighting to protect her homestead, she was fighting to protect the entire pattern of land use that made the small ranches and homesteads of the Harrowfield area viable. She had thought about this, too. In those long winter nights with the lamp burning low and the papers spread across her kitchen table, she had thought not only about how to stop the railroad's current route, but about what a workable alternative would look like. One that let the railroad do what it genuinely needed to do while routing around the inhabited land. She had drawn those maps as well. She had 3 alternative routes sketched out, with distance calculations, grade estimates based on the geological surveys she had read, and notes on which federal land parcels each route would need to cross. When she laid those alternative maps on the table on the second day of negotiation, Vetch's surveyor, Prentice, who had by this point moved from quiet wariness to something closer to genuine professional respect, bent over them for a long time and then said, "This northern route. She's got the grade right." Vetch looked at the northern route. It was longer by 12 miles than the original plan, which meant additional construction cost. But it stayed entirely on federal land parcels that had never been homesteaded, which meant right-of-way acquisition would be straightforward, and it avoided the ravine entirely rather than bridging it, which saved even more money. It was a better route. The railroad's engineers, when Vetch wired them the specifications 2 days later, agreed. The negotiation ended with a formal agreement, signed by Vetch on behalf of the Great Western Railroad, abandoning the contested route and accepting the northern alternative. The eminent domain filings against both Lillian Keene's homestead and Joel Bailey's ranch were officially withdrawn. Lillian walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon light of a Kansas spring, and the first thing she did was sit down on the courthouse steps, because her legs, which had been reliable through 4 months of preparation and 3 days of negotiation, had apparently reached their limit. Joel Bailey came out behind her and sat down beside her on the step without asking permission, which she found she did not mind. Around them, the men of Harrowfield were doing the thing that men of Harrowfield did, dispersing into small groups to discuss what they had just witnessed in voices ranging from bafflement to grudging admission. Garrett Hollies, the railroad's land agent, who had been spreading money through the county for a year on the assumption that this territory was his to route a railroad through, had left the courthouse first and had not looked at anyone on his way out. A man who had lost quietly tends to leave quietly. Lillian and Joel sat on the steps in the mild April air and did not speak for a while. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had been in an extended shared tension together and were only now exhaling. "Your husband knew," Joel said eventually. "Knew what? What you could do." Lillian thought about Thomas. About the long evenings when she would read and he would mend tack, the way he had always deferred to her in the paperwork, the way he had said once, quietly and without particular ceremony, that she was the smartest person he had ever met and that he was aware of it every day. "He knew some of it," she said. "Harrowfield does not," Joel said. "Harrowfield knows now," she said, which was true. He looked at her. In the late afternoon light, with the tension of the courthouse gone, she could see his face more clearly than she usually allowed herself to. He was 34 years old. She knew that much from county records, unmarried, arrived in Harrowfield in 1869 with enough money to file on the land and begin building the ranch. The dark eyes that everyone in town described as unreadable were not unreadable to her. They were reading. They were reading her, with a precision and an attention she recognized because it was the same way she looked at the things she needed to understand. "I owe you an apology of my own," he said. "For what?" "For assuming in November that what you needed was to be offered a position under my lawyer's filing." Lillian considered that. "You did not know what I was working on." "No, but I assumed, without asking." A pause, that was arrogance. She appreciated the straightforwardness of it. No performance of remorse, no elaborate self-flagellation, just a clean and direct acknowledgement. She said, "I accept the apology." He looked at her for another moment. "Have supper with me," he said. The directness of it startled a small laugh out of her, which she had not expected. She had not laughed like that in a long time, something that came up involuntarily rather than being produced for social purposes. She pressed her fingers briefly over her mouth and then lowered her hand, because she did not need to hide it. "All right," she said. They ate at the hotel dining room in Harrowfield, the two of them at a corner table while the town conducted a very poorly concealed collective observation of the event. Lillian was used to being watched. She had been watched since Thomas died, in the way that women alone are always watched, catalogued, assessed for vulnerability. This was different watching. This was the watching of people who had just been surprised and were revising their assessments. She let them watch. She was too tired to care much, and the food was hot. And Joel Bailey was, across a table, a surprisingly easy person to talk to once he turned toward you. He talked about the ranch, about the cattle operation, about a water rights dispute he had resolved 2 years earlier through a combination of survey documentation and an argument before the county water board that had taken him most of a winter to prepare. When he described this, she said, "You researched it yourself." And he said yes, that lawyers in this territory tended to know a great deal about certain things and very little about the specific land, and that the only person who would put in the hours to understand the particulars of a specific parcel was the person who had to live on it. She felt the conversation, which had begun as the reasonable exchange of two neighbors who had survived a shared ordeal, shift at some point into something else, something that moved at a different register. She noticed the shift and did not retreat from it, which told her something about herself that she filed away quietly. He told her, at some point over coffee, that he had come to Kansas from Colorado. That before the ranch, he had spent 3 years working for a surveying company, which was where he had learned enough about land measurement to recognize, when she had laid open her folio in the courthouse, exactly how precisely done her work was. He said this simply, without performance, and it sat between them on the table with a certain weight. She said, "Is that why you moved? The surveying work ended." He was quiet for a moment, in a way that was different from his usual silence. "My partner in the surveying company was not honest about the work we were filing," he said. "We were doing boundary surveys for mining companies in Colorado. He was falsifying the results to benefit specific parties. When I found out, I refused to continue it. The company dissolved, and then there were questions about my involvement." A pause. "The questions were eventually resolved, but I had already decided to go somewhere different." She heard the whole shape of it, the betrayal, the dark past that was not his corruption but that had marked him anyway, the way unjust things mark people in a way that fair things never quite do. "Did the questions follow you here?" "They did for a while. There is a man in this county, Warren Cole, who was involved in the Colorado situation on the mining company's side. He knows I came here. He has not been a problem, but he is not an ally." A brief pause. "I mention it because you should know, since we are evidently going to be in one another's business from here." The last part was said with a quality that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one, a dry, self-aware warmth, and Lillian felt the temperature in her chest do something inconvenient again. She said, "I believe I can handle Warren Cole if it comes to it." He looked at her across the table with those dark, attentive eyes, and this time the thing behind them was fully visible, a warmth that was direct and unguarded, that had abandoned the wall he normally kept in place. "I believe you can," he said. The supper lasted 2 hours and ended with the hotel dining room empty, except for the two of them and the patience of the cook, who finally began rather loudly clattering pots in the kitchen as a polite signal. They walked out into the warm April night, and the street was quiet, and the stars were extraordinary in the way Kansas stars always were, spread from horizon to horizon with a density that made you feel small and on certain nights, in a good way. Joel walked her to the house where she was staying the night, the home of the county recorder's clerk Davies, who had lent her the legal texts through the winter and whose wife had opened their spare room to Lillian for the duration of the courthouse proceedings. At the gate, they stopped. It was a lamplight kind of moment, soft and warm and slightly suspended, and Lillian was aware of it in the specific way that a woman is aware of such things when she has been alone for more than a year and has deliberately not thought about being anything other than alone. Joel said, "I want to say something that may be forward," she said. "Go ahead. I have been watching you this winter." Not in a way that was designed, in a way that I could not stop and did not particularly want to. He said it plainly, without the flourishes of courtship, without the performed vulnerability that some men use to make declarations feel safer, just the honest fact of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know. I have been watching you too." He looked at her. The lamplight caught his face, and the thing she saw there was not what she had expected, not relief or triumph, but a kind of careful, serious attention, the look of a man who understood that what was being acknowledged between them was real and therefore not to be rushed. "Then I would like to call on you," he said. "If you are willing." "I am willing," she said. He touched his hat. She went inside, and behind the dark of the spare room window, with the lamp out and the Kansas night alive with its million indifferent stars, Lillian Keene lay awake for a long time, but not with anxiety and not with loneliness, and not with the cold, mechanical dread that had kept her awake through so many nights of the previous winter. She lay awake with a feeling that was warm at its edges and complicated at its center, the feeling of something that had been closed beginning, cautiously and without commitment to any particular direction, to open. Joel Bailey called on her the following week. He rode to her homestead on a Thursday afternoon when the spring grass was coming in thick and green, and the creek that ran along the eastern edge of her property was running clear and bright from the melt. He brought nothing performative. He did not bring flowers or candy or any of the tokens that frontier courtship usually employed as shorthand for intention. He brought a question. He had been reviewing the geological survey reports he had acquired independently for the ranch, and he wanted to ask her about a water rights implication of the Northern Railroad route that he could not quite work out from the available documentation. Lillian saw through this immediately. She saw through it, and she was charmed by it, and she answered his question in full, and then asked him a related question about the subsurface water table that she had also been thinking about. And they spent the afternoon at her kitchen table with maps and documents spread between them. And it was the most natural afternoon she had spent since Thomas died, and also nothing like anything she had spent with Thomas, because this was different in a way she was not yet ready to put precise language to. He came back the following Thursday, and the one after that. By the third visit, they were not exclusively talking about land records. By the fifth, they were taking a long walk along the creek in the late afternoon light, talking about Colorado, about Kansas, about the particular quality of silence on the open prairie that was different from any other kind of silence, spacious rather than empty, alive rather than dead. He told her about the ranch he was building, the long-term plans he had for the herd, the water improvements he had been designing. She told him about her intention, which she had held privately through the whole winter, to expand her homestead's operation now that the railroad threat was resolved, to increase the herd, to apply for an additional land filing on the federal parcel adjacent to her eastern boundary that had become available. He said, "You could file on the parcel north of mine as well. It adjoins your current eastern fence line more closely than you might think." She said, "I had considered it." He said, "It would make us neighbors in a more complete sense." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the April air was warm and the creek was talking to itself over the stones, and the particular word neighbors hung between them doing a great deal more work than the word itself usually had to do. She said, "That seems like a reasonable development." He looked, briefly and completely, like a man who had just been told that something he had been careful not to hope for was going to be all right. The expression lasted only a second before his composure reestablished itself, but she saw it and she kept it. May came, then June. The courtship of Lillian Keene and Joel Bailey proceeded through the long Kansas spring, with a kind of deliberate thoroughness that matched their individual characters. Careful, intelligent, not slow out of timidity, but measured out of mutual respect for the real weight of what was being built. The town of Harrowfield watched, as Harrowfield always watched, and the observations ranged from approving to baffled, with several notable voices, particularly among the men who had been in the courthouse, expressing views that were something in the neighborhood of reverence, the particular reverence that surprises even the people feeling it. Martha Albright, who ran the dry goods store and was the closest thing Harrowfield had to a social institution, told the woman who did her mending that she had never seen two people court each other like they were surveying a joint property claim, and that she meant it as the highest possible compliment. Davies, the county recorder's clerk, told his wife privately that he had always known Mrs. Keene was exceptional, and that it appeared Mr. Bailey had the good sense to recognize it, which was more than most men in this territory could claim. In July, Warren Cole made an appearance. He was a broad, florid man of about 50, with the look of someone who had spent his life profiting from situations other people created, and had aged into a kind of comfortable unconcern about who paid for his comfort. He arrived in Harrowfield one Sunday afternoon and was seen in conversation with Garrett Hollies, which was the first sign of trouble because Hollies, despite the railroad route defeat, had not left the county. Joel told Lillian about Warren Cole's arrival on Monday, riding over to her homestead directly, not waiting for Thursday. She was in the field with her ranch hands, checking fence line on the south quarter, and she came over to the fence when she saw him ride up, pulling off her work gloves. He told her the situation without editorializing. Cole had come to Harrowfield. Cole's connection to him was the Colorado surveying situation. Cole had never had any direct power over him, but he had information that could be used, specifically the fact that Joel had worked for the company during the period when the falsified surveys were being filed, and that while he had been cleared of involvement by the investigation, the clearing was a private matter, and Cole could cause public trouble by raising questions. Lillian listened to all of it. Then she said, "What does Cole want?" Joel said, "I do not know yet, but Hollies is involved, which means the railroad's interests are involved, which means it is probably about the land." "The railroad accepted the northern route," Lillian said. "The railroad accepted it under Vetch's authority. Vetch has since been replaced." A pause. "There is a new regional director. His name is Aldridge. He took over last month." Apparently Aldridge is not as willing to accept the additional 12 miles. She absorbed this, felt the familiar cold clarity settle in. They want to reopen the negotiation. I believe that is the direction this is heading. Cannot reopen it. The agreement was formally signed and filed. No, Joel said, but they can make the environment hostile enough that it becomes difficult to hold, especially if Cole starts raising questions about me in the county. She looked at him steadily. "What exactly does Cole have?" "My name on 3 survey documents from the period when my partner was falsifying reports. The reports I signed off on were accurate, but they have my signature, and Cole can present it however he chooses." "Do you have the originals of the accurate reports you filed?" A pause. "Some of them." "Where?" "Stored at the ranch in a locked box." She was quiet for a moment, doing the calculation. "We need to establish the provenance of those documents. Get them formally filed with the county recorder before Cole can create a competing narrative." She peeled off the other work glove. "Can you get me access to the documents this week?" He looked at her in that way he had, the attentive, direct look that she had come to recognize as his version of being moved. "You are already 2 steps ahead," he said. "I am trying to stay ahead," she said. "It is how you survive out here." They spent the following week working through the documentation together. Lillian recognized, in the Colorado surveying records, the same kind of legal jurisdictional structure she had worked with during the railroad fight: baseline standards, survey certification, chain of custody. The key was establishing that the documents Joel had signed were consistent with accurate measurements, which they could demonstrate by cross-referencing the original field notes, which Joel had kept, against independent sources. Davies at the county recorder's office helped them file the relevant documents formally. He did not ask many questions, but he was thorough and precise, and he worked quickly. Warren Cole arrived at Joel's ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, alone, which told Lillian something important when Joel described it to her later. A man who arrived alone to deliver a threat was either confident of easy intimidation or was, in fact, not entirely committed to the threat. He had offered a version of what she had predicted: quiet withdrawal if Joel sold the eastern 10 acres of his ranch, the strip that had been the original target of the railroad's contested route, to a land-holding company that would then facilitate the railroad's original alignment. Joel had told him that the agreement with the railroad was legal and binding, and not subject to private renegotiation. Cole had not responded directly to that. He had said only that he hoped Joel had a clean record to point to if the Colorado situation were to come up publicly. Then he had left. Joel told Lillian this the same evening, riding to her homestead in the long summer dusk. She was on the porch, the last of the paperwork from the week spread on the porch table, and the light was the color of warm honey and the air smelled of grass and coming rain. She said, "He is testing the response. Not the final move yet." "He will come back," Joel agreed. "He will come back, and next time it will be more specific." She was quiet for a moment. "You should write to the survey company's former investors, the ones who lost money when the company dissolved. Offer them a formal statement about what happened and your role in it. Do it before Cole can define the narrative." Joel looked at her across the porch. The evening light was doing things to her face that he had noticed before, that she had noticed him noticing, and that they had not yet directly addressed, though it was increasingly crowding the space between all their other conversations. He said, "How do you know how to do this?" She said, "I read everything. I have read everything since I was 12 years old. I read law books and land records and survey reports and anything I could get my hands on, not because I had a plan. Because I was hungry for it." A pause. "Thomas used to say I should have been a lawyer." "Thomas was right," Joel said. She smiled at that, a full smile which was different from her contained daytime expression, which was different from the brief surprised laugh in the courthouse, which was its own category of rare. This was something she chose to let out. She said, "In this territory, in this time, what I am is a rancher who reads too much." "What you are," he said, "is the most remarkable person in this county. And I include myself in that comparison without hesitation." The smile held for a moment longer. Then she said, "Write the letters. I will draft them with you." They drafted the letters together. 2 evenings of it, Joel's handwriting on the page and Lillian's thinking in every line of it. And they sent them out to 7 former investors of the Colorado Surveying Company, and to the Territorial Business Registry, and to the investigator who had originally cleared Joel of involvement, requesting a formal letter of his finding to be filed with Harrowfield County records. Warren Cole came back to Harrowfield in August. This time he went not to the ranch but to the county commissioner's office, where he made a formal complaint against Joel Bailey's land records, citing the Colorado connection. What he did not know was that the county commissioner, a man named Hartfield who was not the county's most energetic official but was reliably uninterested in drama he had not invited, had already received Joel's filed documentation through Davies' office and had been briefed, by Davies, on the provenance of the records. Cole's complaint was reviewed. The documentation Cole presented was the same surface-level assertion that Joel's name appeared on surveys during the period of the fraud. The counter-documentation established clearly that Joel's signed surveys were accurate, and that the fraud had been committed specifically on documents he had not signed. The complaint was dismissed within a week. Garrett Hollies left Harrowfield County by the end of August. Warren Cole left shortly after. The new railroad director, Aldridge, apparently found that reopening negotiations with Harrowfield County, which now had a formal signed agreement, a county full of documented records, and a widow whose name had become something of a watchword in the Territorial Land Office, was not worth the effort. The northern route held. The threat dissolved quietly, the way threats built on deception tend to dissolve when precision is brought to bear on them. And in the aftermath of it, in the warm, bright close of a Kansas summer, Lillian Keene and Joel Bailey found themselves on the far side of the last obstacle they had been using, unconsciously and cooperatively, to keep their relationship at the productive distance of shared purpose. One Saturday evening in late August, Joel came to her homestead not with documents or a question or a situation to address. He came in clean clothes with his hat in his hand, and when she came to the door he said, without preamble and without the careful verbal architecture they usually built around important things, "I want to ask you something." She stepped out onto the porch. The evening was warm and the cicadas were loud in the grass, and the sky was going from orange to deep blue in that particular way it did in late summer, everything vivid and saturated before the dark came. He said, "I have been in this county for 5 years, and I have been alone for every one of them, not because I had no choice, but because I had not found a person I wanted to be with who was worth being honest with. And then you walked into a courthouse with 4 months of hidden work in a leather folio, and dismantled a railroad company's legal strategy, and since then I have thought about you every single day. And I have tried to be patient and I have tried to be careful because I know you have been alone too, and in a different kind of way, and I did not want to rush you into something before you were ready." She was very still. "But I am not a patient man by nature," he continued, "and pretending to be one is starting to cost me more than I am willing to pay." He looked at her directly. "I am asking you to marry me, Lillian, not because you need protection or management or assistance. You have demonstrated to the satisfaction of the entire county that you need none of those things. I am asking because I want to build something with the person I respect most in the world, and that person is you." The cicadas continued their vast, indifferent music in the grass. Lillian stood very still for another moment, and then she said, "You should know that I will not become less difficult or more manageable as a wife than I have been as a neighbor." He said, "I am counting on it," she said. "Then yes." He stepped up onto the porch and he kissed her. For the first time, which was not tentative and not cautious because the relationship itself had been both of those things for long enough. And Lillian, who had been careful and controlled and tactically precise through a 1.5 years of widowhood and a railroad fight and a land records battle, found that being kissed by Joel Bailey in the warm late August evening on her own porch was one of the very few things she had encountered in her 31 years that she had no desire whatsoever to manage. They were married in October, on a Saturday, in the small white-painted church at the edge of Harrowfield that neither of them attended with any regularity, before a congregation that included most of the county, the entirety of the courthouse crowd from the spring, Davies and his wife in the third pew with expressions of uncontained satisfaction, and Martha Albright from the dry goods store, who cried with an enthusiasm that she would afterward attribute to hay fever. The ceremony was brief. The celebration afterward was not. Joel's ranch hands and Lillian's ranch hands had organized it between them with the practical efficiency of people who work with their hands for a living, and there was food and there was music, and there was dancing in the long grass beside the church, while the October stars came out one by one in the vast Kansas sky. Joel danced with his wife on the grass, and she was not, as it turned out, a reserved dancer, which surprised him, and he told her so. She said that she had been dancing since she was 5 years old at her father's house in Missouri, and that she saw no reason to stop simply because she had spent the last year being professionally formidable. He laughed at that, a full, unguarded laugh, which was rare enough that several of his ranch hands noticed it and exchanged a look of quiet satisfaction. They rode to the ranch together that night under a half-moon, and the land was silver and black and absolutely quiet. And the size of it, the wide-open, uncontainable size of the Kansas country, felt for the first time in Lillian's experience not like something to survive, but like something to inhabit. She had spent her whole adult life in this landscape learning its logic, its seasons, its hidden legal structures, its economic patterns. She had never quite let herself simply be inside it. Looking at it from the back of her horse in the October moonlight, with Joel Bailey riding beside her and the ranch lights visible in the distance, she let herself be inside it for the first time. It was a different feeling from any other form of satisfaction she had known. Quieter, more complete. The first winter of their marriage was busy in the particular way of two intelligent, high-energy people who had been operating independently and were now merging two operations. There were practical matters that required navigation, whose ranch hands worked which pasture, how the account books were organized, who had authority over what decisions. They navigated these things the way they navigated everything, directly, specifically, without performance. There were two genuine arguments, not loud ones but thorough ones, about the management of the shared water rights on the creek, and about a contract Joel had entered with a cattle buyer in Topeka that Lillian thought undervalued the herd. And in both cases they argued it through to a resolution that neither had started with, which was the specific pleasure of arguing with a person who is your intellectual equal. The water rights they resolved with a new agreement that Lillian drafted and Joel revised, which was more precise than either of their individual approaches had been. The Topeka contract they renegotiated together with an outcome 20% more favorable than the original. In March, Lillian told Joel she was pregnant. He was in the barn, checking a fence wire repair on one of the interior stalls, and she came in from the house and told him directly, without ceremony, because that was how they told each other things. He set down the wire cutters. He looked at her for a moment. And then he crossed the space between them with a speed and directness that was nothing like the contained, measured composure he usually wore. And he wrapped both arms around her in a hold that was entirely and completely without reserve, his face in her hair. And he said nothing for a long time. And what was happening in that silence was something that did not require any words and was better without them. Their son was born in November of 1875, on a cold, clear morning when the first snow was on the ground outside the ranch house windows. The delivery was attended by the county physician and by Martha Albright, who turned out to have more practical experience with this than anyone in the county had known, and who was calm and efficient, and told Lillian at one point during the long hours of it that she was doing beautifully, with a warmth that was different from the woman's usual voluble social presence, and was, in that moment, exactly right. Joel was in the next room for most of it. At some point he was allowed in, and he sat beside Lillian on the edge of the bed, his son in the crook of his arm, his wife watching him with eyes that were tired and clear and full of something that had no name available to her but that she was perfectly content to leave unnamed. She said, "What should we call him?" He thought about it. "Thomas," he said, "if you have no objection. It was your husband's name, and he sounds like a man worth remembering." She looked at him for a long moment. The specific quality of the thing she felt for Joel Bailey in that moment, the breadth and depth of it, the way it was built not just from feeling but from knowing him, from understanding exactly what he was and choosing it with full information, was something she filed away in the deepest and most permanent part of herself. "Thomas Joel Bailey," she said. He nodded and looked back at the boy, who was small and dark-haired, and appeared to be considering the world with an expression of alert concentration that both of them recognized immediately and would mention for years afterward. The railroad ran its northern route through federal land in 1876. A station was established 8 miles north of Harrowfield, which brought additional commerce to the county and benefited everyone who had been afraid the railroad would pass them by entirely. The route Lillian had drawn in the long winter of her work turned out, as Prentice had said, to be genuinely better. The grade was smoother, the construction costs were lower, and the station placement served the county more centrally than the original contested route would have done. Nobody on the railroad's end officially credited this to Lillian Keene's alternative maps, but Prentice, who had moved on from the Great Western to an independent surveying practice in Topeka, sent her a letter in the spring of 1876 that said simply, "The grade came out as you calculated. I thought you would want to know. Your work was correct." She kept the letter in the leather folio with the rest of the courthouse documents. Joel expanded the herd in 1876, making use of the land parcel Lillian had filed on adjacent to the eastern boundary. Between the two original homesteads, now formally merged into a single filing under the name Bailey, they had built one of the more substantial ranch operations in Harrowfield County, not the largest, but one of the most precisely and thoughtfully managed, with water rights that were fully documented. A cattle contract with the Topeka buyer renegotiated to their satisfaction, and a reputation that was quietly but solidly tied to competence and integrity rather than to size or aggression. Lillian continued to work. She always had, and she did not stop because she was married or because she was a mother or because either of those things would have seemed, to any external observer, like sufficient occupation. She helped other homesteaders in the county who received land threats or survey disputes, not as a lawyer, since she had no credentials, but as what she was, a person who read everything and understood how the documentation worked and could explain it to anyone who sat across a table from her. Davies sent people to her when they came to his office bewildered by the paperwork of their own land claims. She never charged for it. It was, she told Joel once, just the kind of work she needed to do. In 1877, a young woman named Ada Hartfield, the commissioner's daughter, came to Lillian with a land claim dispute involving a section of her family's homestead that was being challenged by a neighboring rancher who had filed a competing survey. Lillian worked through the documents with Ada over several weeks, and in the process, discovered that Ada had a quick and precise mind of her own, a hunger for the legal and documentary side of things that reminded Lillian of herself at an earlier age. She encouraged Ada to write to a women's college in the East about the possibility of studying law. Ada was skeptical that such a path was available to her. Lillian was not the kind of person who accepted other people's skepticism about possibilities she had personally tested, and she made this clear to Ada in a way that was affectionate but not uncertain. Ada wrote the letter. The path was long and the obstacles were real, but she pursued it. These things mattered, Lillian thought. The individual threads mattered. Not just the large fights, not just the courthouse victories, but the smaller acts of passing knowledge along to someone who would use it. She had received knowledge from everyone who had ever left a book or a document where she could read it, from Davies' quiet professional assistants, from the county recorder's records that were technically public, from the federal land office correspondence that had never refused her a factual answer, even when it had no idea it was answering a woman preparing a case. You built from what was available, and you passed what you built forward, and over time that was how anything changed. Joel, who understood her thinking because he paid attention, was entirely supportive of the work with Ada and with others who came after. He was, in the years of their marriage, consistently and demonstrably the partner she had chosen him to be, not in the sense of smooth performance, but in the grittier and more honest sense of a person who showed up, who was present, who did not condescend to her work or manage her priorities. He had his own strong opinions and he expressed them, and they disagreed with real substance on real things, and it was always worth the disagreement because, on the other side of it, they had usually arrived at something better than either of them had started with. Their second child arrived in 1878. A girl this time, born in the late spring, healthy and immediately loud about it, dark-eyed like her father, and with her mother's expression of focused assessment. They named her Clara after Lillian's mother, who had died when Lillian was 16 and who had been, by every account Lillian could construct from memory, a woman who read too much and thought too precisely for the world she had been born into. Thomas, at 3 years old, received his sister with the dignified seriousness of a small person who has been told an important thing is happening and is determined to handle it correctly. He touched the baby's hand with one careful finger and then looked up at his father with an expression that Joel described afterward as the most thorough inventory he had ever seen conducted. The ranch grew. The county grew. Harrowfield acquired a proper school in 1879, with a building and a full-time teacher, and Lillian was on the committee that established it, not in the background, not as a supporting voice, but as one of the primary architects of the curriculum and the process, because she had opinions about education that were informed by everything she had taught herself, and they were not opinions she intended to leave unspoken. Joel attended the school committee meetings with her and was, at these meetings, primarily quiet, occasionally devastating when he spoke, always fully present. He had a habit, in public settings, of sitting slightly behind and to the right of wherever Lillian was speaking, not in a way that was subordinate but in a way that was deliberate, a physical expression of whose work this was and whose voice should be heard. She noticed it every time and never mentioned it, because some things are better received as actions than as words. In 1880, a reporter from the Kansas City Journal came through Harrowfield researching a story on the railroad expansion through the territory. He heard about the 1874 courthouse negotiation from several people, the story having become firmly embedded in local history by this point, and he requested an interview with Lillian Bailey, as she was then formally named. She agreed to the interview and gave it plainly and without modesty, because modesty about facts was a form of dishonesty, and she had no interest in it. The story ran in the Journal in October of 1880, under the headline, "Prairie Widow Turns Tables on Railroad Company," which was not the headline she would have chosen but was, she admitted to Joel, accurate. It described the 1874 negotiation in detail, including the months of preparation, the baseline meridian discrepancy, the alternative route maps, the resolution. It named her correctly. It quoted her at length. The response from readers was larger than the Journal's editor had anticipated. Several letters to the editor came from women in various parts of Kansas and Missouri who had described similar situations: land disputes, legal threats, the particular vulnerability of women landowners operating without legal credentials or male advocacy. A few asked how to access the same documentary resources Lillian had used. She answered 2 letters directly and referred the others to the county land offices in their respective territories. Joel read the article the morning it arrived, which was a Thursday. He read it twice, because he had been there for all of it, and it was still remarkable to see it assembled in a public account. Then he set the paper down and looked at her across the breakfast table over the heads of Thomas, who was 5 and eating oatmeal with the focused dedication of someone completing an assignment, and Clara, who was 2 and mostly distributing her oatmeal across a wider radius than was strictly necessary. He said, "The headline is wrong." She said, "It is somewhat reductive. You are not only the Prairie Widow. You were already the best land surveyor in this county before any of it happened. The widow part was incidental." She looked at him. "The widow part was what they expected to define me." "Yes," he said, "they were wrong." "They were wrong," she agreed, and felt the specific satisfaction of a woman who has been told she was wrong about something she knew she was right about and has lived to see the record corrected, not for the approval, for the precision of it. Because Lillian Keene Bailey had always been, at her core, a person who needed the record to be correct. The years that followed were full years. Not without difficulty, There were hard winters and cattle losses, and the ongoing complexity of water rights in a territory that was filling up faster than its legal infrastructure could manage, but full in the way that matters, in the way that is the opposite of the hollow, waiting-out quality of the months after Thomas Keene died, when she had worked and planned and executed and hidden her light under the exhausting necessity of strategic concealment. She did not have to hide anything anymore. Not from her husband, not from her county, not from the record. What she knew was documented. What she could do was demonstrated. The women who came to her kitchen table with their land problems were treated to the same precision and complete attention she had always given to everything, and sent home with a clearer understanding of their situation, and usually a specific document to file. Joel built the water improvement he had been designing since before they were married, a series of channels and holding structures on the ranch that improved water distribution to the north pasture and increased the carrying capacity of the land substantially. It took 2 summers and the specific help of Davy's wife's brother, who turned out to have experience with hydraulic engineering from a previous life in Pennsylvania, and when it was finished, it was one of the better pieces of practical engineering in that part of Kansas. Lillian helped him design the grade levels, because the geological survey reports she had read years earlier were relevant, and because it was simply the work she would do with information she had, regardless of whose project it technically was. Thomas, at 7, began helping in the field in the limited way that children do, holding things and fetching tools and asking questions with an appetite for understanding the mechanics of everything that his parents found familiar and quietly delighted in. Clara, at 4, had discovered an interest in the horses that was total and unconditional, and that manifested as an insistence on being taken to the barn every morning before breakfast, which Joel accommodated with the kind of complete parental flexibility that the specific intensity of Clara's small-person convictions seemed to require. In 1882, Lillian discovered she was pregnant again. She was 39 years old, and she told Joel with the same directness she had told him the first time, and he responded with the same complete and unguarded hold, his face in her hair. And this time when he spoke it was to say that he had not known, when he rode into this county with a sealed past and a plan to stay quiet and work hard and want nothing he could not control, that the world was going to hand him this much. He said this quietly and without performance, because that was how he said the things that were most true. Their third child, a boy they named Samuel, was born in early 1883, a spring birth, the easiest of the 3 deliveries, in a ranch house that was warm and full, and had the settled quality of a place where people have lived honestly for some years. Martha Albright was there again, older now and slightly slower but no less practically capable, and she held Samuel at the window in the afternoon light and said that he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and that Harrowfield County had better start making room. The county made room. It had been making room, gradually and sometimes reluctantly, for some time now. The story that Harrowfield told about itself included Lillian Bailey in a way it had not included Lillian Keene, which was an injustice of its own kind, because she had been exactly the same person before the marriage as after, the same intelligence, the same capability, the same fierce and private commitment to the accuracy of the record. What had changed was that she had a witness. A visible, credible, fully engaged witness who had chosen her publicly and without equivocation, and who stood slightly behind and to her right when she spoke, and whose standing there meant that the room listened differently. She had thought about this sometimes, in the quiet way she thought about everything. The injustice of it was real. The fact that a woman's abilities became legible to a community mainly when endorsed by a man she had married was a structural problem that one courthouse negotiation and one newspaper article and one schoolroom committee could not fix. She knew that. She was not sentimental about it. But she also knew that what she had built in Harrowfield, with Joel, with her children, with the accumulated work of 15 years on the prairie, was genuinely hers in a way that could not be taken. Not the land, though the land was real and the documents were filed and the boundaries were correct, but the knowledge, the capacity, the record of what she had done and how she had done it, filed with the county, reported in the journal, passed forward to Ada Hartfield and the other women who sat at her kitchen table with their land papers and their bewilderment. That record was not contingent on any man's endorsement. It was the public factual truth, and she had always believed in the public factual truth as the most durable thing available to a person who intended to last. On a Sunday in the spring of 1883, when Samuel was 2 months old and sleeping in the house, and Thomas was in the barn with his father, and Clara was at the fence watching the horses, Lillian sat on the porch in the late afternoon light with a cup of coffee and the current issue of the Kansas City Journal. She was reading an article about a land dispute in the Oklahoma Territory that had several features she recognized from the 1874 situation, the same kind of survey baseline inconsistency, the same railroad pressure, the same assumption that the landowners in question, in this case a group of Cherokee families whose allotment land was being challenged, would not have the documentation to mount an effective defense. She read the article twice. Then she set the journal on the porch railing and looked out at the prairie. The spring grass was coming in the way it always did, profligate and unstoppable, covering everything in a green so vivid it looked almost artificial. The sky was wide and pale blue, and the light on it was the particular gold of late afternoon in Kansas, that light she had hated when she first arrived, before she understood it, and had come to love with the specific love of a person who has spent enough time with something to know its whole nature. Joel came out of the barn and walked across to the porch, brushing hay from his sleeve. He came up the steps and looked at the journal on the railing and then at her face and said, "What is it?" She told him about the Oklahoma article. He listened without interrupting, which was the thing she valued most in anyone who listened to her, the simple and not common ability to receive information without overlaying it with premature conclusion. When she finished, he said, "You want to write to them?" "I want to do more than write," she said. "I want to send the documentation, the baseline meridian argument, the GLO letter, all of it. It is directly applicable." He was quiet for a moment. "That is weeks of work." "Compiling and annotating." "Yes," she said, "and they may not receive it well, given the source." She said, "It will not be the first time I have sent information to people who did not initially expect it from me." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the afternoon light was on both their faces, and the prairie spread out behind them to the horizon in every direction, wide and indifferent and completely available, in the way the best things are available, if you have the patience and the precision to make use of them. "I will help you compile it," he said. She reached across and put her hand over his, briefly, with the ease of people who have been touching each other for 9 years and understand the weight of it. "I know you will," she said. And then she picked up the journal again and finished reading the article, because there was more to understand and she intended to understand all of it. Clara came up onto the porch in her dusty boots with a piece of halter rope she had found somewhere and an expression of complete creative purpose, and asked her mother to show her again how to tie a square knot that would not slip. Lillian set down the paper and showed her daughter's small hands the movement of the rope, once, twice, 3 times, until the knot was right. Clara tested it, found it sound, and went back down the steps with the rope and her purpose, trailing a cloud of dust and absolute conviction. Joel watched her go, and then looked at Lillian with an expression that was, all these years on, still capable of catching her off guard with its directness and its depth. He said, "You know what I think about sometimes." "What?" "The courthouse steps, that afternoon in April. You sat down on the steps because your legs gave out and I thought you would not let me see it, but you did not hide it." She remembered. The way the exhaustion had come up through her all at once after 4 months of holding it back. The way she had simply sat down because there was nothing else to do, and he had sat down beside her, and neither of them had pretended it was anything other than what it was. "I was too tired to hide it," she said. "I know," he said. "That is when I knew." She looked at him. "When you knew what?" "That you were someone I could trust." He paused. The work was already obvious. The ability, that was visible from the folio maps. But the moment on the steps when you let it show, that was the other thing. That was the thing that mattered the same amount. Lillian Keene, who had read everything and documented everything and prepared for every contingency she could calculate, had not calculated that. That a man who valued strength might also, in the same breath and with the same weight, value the willingness to be tired. She thought about it, sitting in the afternoon light on the porch of the ranch they had built together, with the sound of Samuel beginning to wake in the house behind them and Thomas's voice carrying from the barn and Clara's boots disappearing in the grass. She thought about the winter she had spent at the kitchen table, drawing maps by lamplight with hands that were steady and a mind that was completely clear and alone. About the courthouse and the folio and the cold certainty. About the steps and how he had sat down beside her without asking. About the long project of building something true in a landscape that was vast enough to contain anything you were willing to bring to it. She said, "You know what I think about sometimes." He waited. "The fence line," she said, "the section you repaired in December without saying anything." He was quiet for a moment. "That was not anything remarkable." "It was remarkable to me," she said, "because nobody had done anything for me in a long time without wanting something for it. And you did it and said nothing about it and went home. And I stood at that fence the next morning for a long time." He looked at her with the direct, unguarded look she still loved after 9 years. "And then I went back to work," she said, "because there was work to do, but I did not forget it." They sat together in the afternoon light, the two of them, while the prairie turned gold around them and the baby's wakening sounds grew more specific in the house, and the evening came on slow and warm from the west, and the Kansas country spread out around the ranch to a horizon so wide it looked like the whole world was offering itself, plain and complete, to anyone willing to see it clearly. Lillian Keene Bailey, who had been a widow and a strategist and a researcher and a fighter, and now was a wife and a mother and a neighbor, and still all the other things, who had documented the injustice done to her land and defended it with her own precision, who had passed what she knew forward to the people who needed it, who had loved and been loved in a way that was equal in its respect and complete in its honesty, set down her coffee and leaned her shoulder against her husband's shoulder in the old, familiar, comfortable way. And the record she had built in documents and maps and memories and children and repaired fences and answered letters and a leather folio that still sat in the oak chest at the foot of the bedroom was precise and permanent in hers, every page of it, every carefully measured line. She had earned it. Every word of it was true, and there was still more to write.